Frank Joseph has been the editor-in-chief of Ancient American magazine since its debut in 1993. He is the author of 20 books about prehistory, including Ancient High Tech, The Astonishing Scientific Achievements of Early Civilizations, Our Places and the Master Builders of Antiquity, Before Atlantis, Advanced Civilizations of Prehistoric America. Joseph is a frequent guest speaker at various metaphysical and archaeological societies in the U.S. and abroad.
Thank you for sharing your time with me this evening. What I'd like to talk to you about is sacred sites. Well, you're all familiar with sacred sites. You've heard of places like Stonehenge and the Great Pyramid of Egypt and so on. But in this particular context, I want to bring up two things that you may or may not be familiar with, or at least partially familiar with. And that is, you don't need to go as far as Britain to see Stonehenge, and you don't need to go to Egypt and places like that, because there are sacred sites right here, literally right in this very city, ancient sacred sites, valuable today. In this regard, we are living at a time in which our own civilization future is in doubt. We are beset by more crises than any previous generation that we know of, economic, in terms of health, political, international, where we have people on all sides with nervous trigger fingers on nuclear weapons. For the first time in so many decades, perhaps never before, has there been serious consideration of nuclear exchange. There have been numerous polls taken about how people feel, especially young people, how they feel about the future of their country, and it's not positive. And we may feel that this is something that has never happened before in human history. And in fact, it has happened before. There are more civilizations in the graveyard of history than there are civilizations around today. Human beings have achieved very high levels of culture in the past, higher than our own in some regards, in many regards, actually, at least in terms of social cooperation, and they all vanished. Whenever a civilization comes to an end, it is never a pretty or an easy affair. And the people that lived here before us, the Native Americans, who are still here, they went through a situation very similar to our own. And they preserved the previous knowledge of this lost high culture better than any book, better than any video documentary. They preserved it in myth, which is kind of unfortunate today because the word myth is synonymous with a lie or a falsehood. But yet myth in reality is nothing more than the dramatization of a particularly important truth. How else does one who does not possess a literate society pass down those things that are dear and important to them, except in the legacy of story? So that when you take a myth and you see the obvious fictional aspects of it, or the poetic aspects of it, and peel back these poetic layers, you see that at its core is a vital truth. If it was a lie or just a story, it would have been lost over a few generations, but the myths survived for countless generations, for thousands of years. And the great myth in question that's so pertinent to our condition today, our situation today, is the myth that's preserved in the Native American tribes of this particular state, or this particular region of the country. And their myth tells of something that happened long ago, very long ago. It's part of their creation stories. And it varies from tribe to tribe in particular details. But in the essentials, that story is this: that the ancestors of Native Americans long ago lived on a great, beautiful island in the Sunrise Sea. And they lived in such harmony with the gods and the goddesses and with nature that it was a time of a paradise on earth. But human beings over time, over the generations, began to feel that they no longer needed the gods or the goddesses or even the forces of nature, that they become so great, so puffed up with their own self-importance, that the gods decided to punish them. And they threw a great fire out of the heavens. This fire collided with the ocean to burn itself out. In doing so, created an enormous wave which overwhelmed this paradise island where the Native American ancestors had lived before so peacefully and productively. And most of them were destroyed. The good people were sorted out by being survivors. They'd lost their land and they're drowning in the Sunrise Sea. And they prayed to, in the Ojibwa version, they prayed to Wesa Hisa. Wesa Hisa means the foolish creator. They regarded God as innocent. In this regard, foolish, not that he was stupid, but that he was childlike. And that's very interesting, just as an aside. In the medieval European Grail romances, they talk about Parsifal being the discoverer of the Holy Grail at a time when his society in the Dark Ages was on its way out, and civilization that was teetering on destruction, and they needed something holy and pure to save it. And that was the Grail, but no one could find the Grail. But Parsifal, known as the pure fool, made wise through compassion, found the Grail and saved European civilization with it. So in that same context, Wesa Hisa, the foolish creator, was really like the childlike innocence that you find in pure compassion. So when the forefathers of the Native Americans were drowning in the sea, they prayed to Wesa Hisa to save them. And he heard them and conjured up a giant that came out of the bottom of the sea with a great horned helmet. Well, a horned helmet, like a buffalo headdress with the horns on it, that's always seen throughout all the tribes as a symbol of spiritual power, great spiritual power. And here is this giant with this big helmet, great horns on it, very powerful. That is Wesa Hisa in that particular configuration. And so he scooped up the survivors of this lost land. He put them on his shoulder and he put them in his pockets, and he carried as many as he could, and there were still many left over. And he said, I can't take you. I don't have any more room for him. I said, well, don't leave us here. Don't leave us to drown. He says, oh, I've got an idea now. And he conjured up a huge turtle from the bottom of the sea. And the rest of the survivors clambered out of the back of the turtle. And they said, okay, well, what do we do now? I said, well, we'll just have to follow the turtle where the turtle wants to go. He knows more about this than I do. And the turtle took off, swimming east with the last of the survivors on the back of his shell, and came to a new land. We landed there, and the people got off of the turtle. Wesa Hisa, the foolish creator, came and delivered all the people onto this new land. And they said, well, what is the name of this land? And Wesa Hisa wonders and says, well, the turtle found it, so let's call it Turtle Island. And that is the name that most Native Americans give to America. It's Turtle Island. So people wandered over this island for a very long time, and they came to two very important places. One place was in northern Minnesota. It wasn't known as Minnesota then, of course. It was not too far from the Canadian border. Some stayed there, and others went further and further west and south. And they came to a place that was very barren looking and a little frightening to them because there was a great waterfall there. They said, ooh, that reminds us of the flood. Wesa Hisa said, well, that's right. This is the place where you have to be. This is for your sacred place, and from here, you will disperse throughout the rest of Turtle Island. And, well, why is this place so special? Because of the waterfall? Well, no, not only that. It's another reason. Look around you. You see these cliffs here. How strange these cliffs look. They look like they're sort of reddish and brown. And that's because I took all of the flesh of your relatives who perished in the flood, and I transformed all of their flesh into this hardened clay. And what you're to do is on an annual ceremony, you are to take this clay, which is now hardened, and you're to fashion a bowl. And in this bowl, you're to put tobacco. And you drill a hole in the bowl, and you put a stem. And you will smoke this. The bowl represents the female principle, and the stem, the male principle. And when you do this, you will do this in memory of your ancestors who sinned against the laws of life and perished. And that you have been saved to carry on where they failed. And to understand that in your own life, you will have your own smaller cataclysms, your own great floods. That will be very hard. But there is no annihilation. There is always regeneration, and that's what's to be learned in these ceremonies. You must learn that for all of the difficulties, the great losses that you have experienced and shall experience, there is always revival and regeneration, no matter how awful it seems. Well, the name of that place, that is now in southwestern Minnesota, is called Pipestone, Minnesota. And the place that is far north, near the Canadian border, has the largest mound, so-called Indian mound, the largest ancient monument, not only in all of Minnesota, but in the upper Midwest. There's none taller and larger, has more volume than this particular mound. Is called Grand Mound, perhaps Minnesota in the southeast. This is Pipestone, Minnesota, we'll talk about later. And Grand Mound, which is the greatest of all of the earthworks, the ancient earthworks in Minnesota, and the greatest one in the whole upper Midwest, right here. And it's unfortunate that it is no longer available to the public. However, there are plans underway that hopefully will reopen it to the public starting next spring. So we'll have to keep looking at that. It was open to the public until not too long ago. What's so special about this mound, besides its size, is that its great age. Most of the mounds that are known throughout almost all of North America are dated probably no earlier than maybe about 1,000 years before Christ, which is a long time ago, 3,000 years ago. But most of them are about 2,000 years old or much less. This mound, however, is well over 2,500 years old, 25 centuries old. They don't know, they meaning the archaeologists, they have really no concrete idea how old it is, and they do not know who made it. They cannot associate it with any known culture. There are village sites around its base that they apparently developed long after this mound was made. What's particularly interesting and unique about this mound, again, is not its size, 25 feet high, and it's shaped rather conical. But what's unusual about it is that it has a tail. And at first, observers thought, well, is this a muskrat that it's able to show? It doesn't look anything like a muskrat. Well, maybe is it a serpent because there are serpent mounds? No, because the tail is straight, more like a comb than undulating like a serpent. And the Native American traditions surrounding it, the various tribes there, they say that their people did not build this. They're absolutely correct about that. There's no tribal affiliation that can be found with the Grand Mound. They said it was created by the oldest people that occupied this part of the world. They were survivors of the Great Flood that appears in their mythic traditions, and that it represents the fire that was thrown out of the sky that created the Great Flood. And that's kind of interesting because all the mounds, and literally all of the mounds in North America, are built on high ground. And the reason they're built on a high ground is to avoid as much water erosion as possible. This mound, however, Grand Mound, is built in a floodplain, the only one. Is it trying to mimic mythically the Great Flood? Perhaps. There are still ceremonies that are performed there. The Native Americans are, of course, allowed to occupy it. They own it, in fact. And there's great impetus amongst many Native American representatives to open it to the general public because they say that their story is everyone's story. They don't consider themselves God's chosen people. They consider themselves a survival, a remnant people. They take their myths very seriously. And this is the first indication of a preservation in myth, in concretized myth, this great mound that has survived more than 25 centuries of the same story that's told today of this fire from heaven. So I can't tell you to go visit the Grand Mound yet, but if we hear anything about change and that it's open again to the public, I'm certainly going to try to let everybody at the Theosophical Society know, because it is a place of great spiritual power. And that's what really constitutes a sacred site. All sacred sites, again, this is a rather broad statement, but it would appear from present Native American behavior and past traditions that all sacred sites, Native American sacred sites, were found by a shaman. And a shaman is nothing more, not a priest necessarily, but someone who is able, through altered states of consciousness, to contact the spirit world. Most tribes, most Native American tribes, before the Europeans made too much of an impact here, had two leaders. There was the chief, who was in charge of all of the mundane aspects of the tribe, hunting, warfare, political organization, all of those things were embodied in the chief. And the second person in command, I say person, because it was not necessarily a man, was the shaman. Many shamans were women. And these persons were able to go, as I said, into altered states of consciousness, and through that to speak and meet with the gods, and then come back to the tribe, as come back through astral projection, a form of astral projection, to share the spiritual knowledge with the people. And every tribe needed a sacred site of some kind. And the shaman was so in tune with the forces of nature, which they thought were inextricable from the forces of heaven, that they could sense various energy concentrations in the earth. And when they would go to a certain spot, they would say, this is the concentration of local energy. And here you must heap up a mound of earth. And heaping up the mound of earth, you are concentrating that energy. The Native Americans had no religion. They were not interested in religion. Religion was totally foreign to them. Only thing they had close to that was experience. They had no interest in doctrine. They had myths, certainly, but they didn't demand that everybody believe or conform directly to the myths. Myths were a way of explaining the experience. And by heaping up the mound and concentrating that earth's energy, it was the duty then of the shaman to introduce members of the tribe to a mystical experience. And in the mystical experience, that's how they were able to interact with the spiritual world, the gods and goddesses, which was pretty much the same as early Christianity or even medieval Christianity. When the great cathedrals were made, there was less emphasis on doctrine than there was on the great experience of walking into Chartres Cathedral or Rouen or any of these marvelous places the tourists go to today. The idea was, again, the experience of God, not the head knowledge. Religion, if it's just theocracy and theology, it's just the head. Trying to approach God, the mind of the cosmos, with our puny little brain matter is pathetic. But we can approach the creator of the universe. So these cathedral builders and Native Americans said, through the heart, not through the head. So they had no need of religion. And as a consequence of that, of course, they had to be exterminated by the Europeans that came here. But in any case, the grand mound would appear to represent this fire. Now, the tail, as it's shown on the mound, is interesting. It's kind of spiky. And in some Native American traditions, they talk about the star as being unusually hairy, a hairy star. That suggests a kind of a comet, perhaps a comet. It's described as a hairy star when it fell into the water. Other traditions is that the gods were so angry with mankind that they threw fire on the earth. This is a tribal variation of the story. And that fire spread all around the world. And the animals prayed to Wesa-Hisa, the foolish creator, and said, hey, look, we weren't responsible for all the immorality and the terrible consequences of mankind here. We're just animals. You're burning us up too. And so Wesa-Hisa said, yeah, you're right. And so he created a great flood which put out the fires. This is their story. Interesting story. And in so doing, by putting out the fires and the great flood, we also wiped out a lot of people. So survivors of the flood are the forefathers, the ancestors of all Native American tribes. Now, this grand mound, as unique as it is not alone. There are marvelous places associated with generally the same thing. And another one is right here in St. Paul. Most people who have lived in St. Paul or driven through it know that at the extreme, towards the extreme eastern end of St. Paul was Mounds Boulevard. You can get off on Mounds Boulevard and you can go there today and you can see these rather unprepossessing mounds of earth. There's 6 of them now, and they're behind a kind of a wrought iron fence. And they're not particularly big. You can't really go running up on them anymore. But they're not really very impressive either. I think they're about maybe 12 feet high, something like that. And they're kind of conical shaped. And that's all. Now there's a plaque up there saying that these are Indian burial mounds. And that's all. Well, that's not all. What you're looking at when you go there is a ruin of a far more magical place than you see today. When you go up there, you see that it's somewhat wooded. It's a park after all, a lot of trees standing around. And a lot is known about these mounds, unlike the Grand Mound, which is a huge mystery. We know very little about that, except through Native American tradition. But a lot is known about the St. Paul Mounds. And you can get this information all from the Minnesota Historical Society. That's where I got it from. Anybody can get this information. It's not privy to scholars or anything like that. It's all laid out in Minnesota Historical Society. But you have to dig it out. And what the archaeologists found and what they know is that about 2,000 years ago, probably a little less than that, about 2,000 years ago, there were people here who were known as the Hopewell. Now, that wasn't their name. We don't know what they were really called. That's just the archaeological name for this people. They were an unusual native people. They were not like the Plains Indians at all. They were hunter-gatherers, but to a far lesser degree. They were people who would appear to be then transition. They were agriculturalists. They were masters of growing squash and raspberries. They had raspberry patches. They cultivated rice in such a way, they parched the rice so it would preserve for a long while. These were innovative agriculturalists. There's skull remains, quite a few are still found, especially in Ohio, show a different genetic people, more gracile skulls. Their skulls are described as more gracile. That doesn't mean they're more graceful. Gracile, in the archaeological term, means a little bit longer, a little more long-headed, a little more sometimes called refined, but long-headed describes them well. And the Hopewell were the mound builders, the famous mound builders. And they were superb astronomers. And what they did at this place, St. Paul's Mounds, is that they created originally 7 mounds. One of the mounds up there has been destroyed long ago. There was some construction going on. And the site chosen for the mounds is remarkable because you have an unobstructed, or you had, I should say, an unobstructed view of the heavens, because the Hopewell completely cleared the entire top of that area that's there today. No park, no trees whatsoever. You had a clear, wonderful view of the sky. It must have been a spectacular view because, of course, there was no pollution then. Clear sky at night was really a fabulous thing to see. Thousands of stars that could be seen with the naked eye easily, we cannot see today. And of these original 7 mounds, after the area had been cleared, were built on top of a subterranean lake or pond or pool. That lake is still there. You can go see and look at it. You can't get into it because there are bars over where the entrances are. And that place was in use, especially in the 1930s, by Al Capone and his merry men. When they would want to get rid of certain people, they'd dump them off in this underwater, or this underground lake, which is still something like about 200 or 300 feet above the airport that's below it. Before Al Capone and his people got there, back around the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, that area was used as a grotto, and they used to have parties and boats, Venetian style boats, to go around and see the little torches they had on the walls. Remarkable. All that's been closed off now. But that place was undoubtedly chosen by some shaman who understood how mystical this place was, to have an underground water source and have this unobstructed view of the heavens. And so they created 7 mounds. And they were not just mounds of earth. If you just had a mound of earth heaped up, soil, that wouldn't exist for more than 2 years, especially the winds up there would have been blown away. These people were construction engineers, and archaeologists began digs on the St. Paul Mounds. They found in cross sections that they did in the structures that they were made of numerous construction materials, strange materials. Sand that had been imported from hundreds of miles away, ground up crystal, various types of clays, layers of thatch, in other words, dried straw, wood, stone. Didn't make any sense. But when the archaeologists were able to recreate the mounds on a smaller scale in the laboratory, they were amazed to find that all these different natural materials interlocked with each other and held its shape extremely strongly. So all those mounds were built by people who understood how natural materials, if used properly, will stay there for 2,000 years. Now, how much of our city that we look at today will be around 2,000 years from now? Hopefully, most of it will not be around. But nonetheless, we can't expect too much of it to be around 2,000 years. It's not made for that. But here was a people who that long ago, 20 centuries ago, not only knew the construction techniques, but applied them for the cause of immortality. When that was done, when they made these mounds, they capped them with different colors. Red clays, yellow clays. We don't know, we do know for sure about that because some of the clays survived. And it was hardened clay, it was baked hardened clay, it was capped. So when you go to this place, you'd see not just mounds of earth, but these red and yellow, kind of like domed figures. They may have been painted, we're not sure. There are no traditions of that, but there are some equivocal pieces of evidence to show that perhaps they were painted. And we would like to think that they were painted, perhaps with astronomical signs, suns and stars and moons and things like that. They still weren't done. At the very top of each of these original 7 mounds, there were cedar posts that had been shaped and painted red. Again, some question about the paint, but they know for sure that these cedar posts were installed at the top because the post holes for them have been found, and shreds or shards of the cedar have been recovered. And that's good because you can carbon date that. So, okay, so 2,200 years ago, that's when all this happened. About the time of Christ. About the time Jesus walked the earth, there was someone here, the Hopewell, whoever they really were, an advanced people who were applying the laws of nature in a very spectacular way. And it is spectacular. Because if you go to the mounds today and you stand at the far end, facing east, they're not in a straight line. Now, these people could have made a perfectly straight line if they wanted to, after having shown their genius in building these mounds themselves. But they didn't. They staggered these post-ridden mounds. They staggered them. And archaeologists wondered about that. Well, why would you do that? So they used early computer technology to determine that the posts and these staggered mounds each aligned either individually and sometimes collectively together to funnel in terrific amounts of celestial information. For example, the main orientation of those mounds is to the constellation of the Pleiades, number one. And that's kind of interesting because there are 7 mounds, or were originally 7 mounds. And the Pleiades comprise, as seen by the naked eye, 7 stars. There are many more than that. Astronomers don't even know how many stars are really in the Pleiades. But from the Earth, it looks like 7 beautiful blue stars. Here we have the 7 mounds. There are other astronomical solar orientations that the mounds were oriented to. For example, the solstices. That's not too hard to align to, but they did that. But one of their alignments is very interesting. The archaeoastronomers found that the St. Paul mounds are also oriented to the rising of the moon at its most northerly point. Well, what's the big deal about that? Well, when the moon rises at its most northerly point, that's when it appears largest in the sky. So if you were to reinstall those posts, which would not be a hard thing to do, you would turn the machine back on. A machine that's been dormant for about 2,000 years or more or less. It'd be like leaving this room abandoned for 2,000 years and finding the power switch, and turning back on the lights. It's that same sort of a thing. Now, there was something else that these people did, and it's difficult for us to appreciate today how different people were and are. For all of this marvelous applied astronomy and these terrific construction techniques, in each one of the mounds was found only one body apiece. It is not a cemetery. It is not a burial ground in the traditional sense. There was one body in each one of these mounds, and the bodies were all the same. They were young teenagers, boys, all about 14 to 15 years of age. And it would appear that they had been ritually killed. And almost certainly they volunteered for that. It's difficult to understand. Why would that be done? What kind of a mythology, what kind of a cruel mythology would appear demonic mythology at work here? This is one of the most interesting things that I'm going to tell you that I found in archaeology anywhere. The traditions appear to point, and the fact that they have these 7 young men buried in these mounds, and the orientation to the Pleiades. The Pleiades were known in ancient Europe and in ancient North America as the 7 sisters. And there's an old poem. No one knows who wrote it in the West. It's called 7 Brides for 7 Bridegrooms. And it's a story about how these seven young men find these seven sisters in the sky, in the heavens. They marry them and they go to heaven with them. They live in heaven with them. It would appear, this is interpretive, but it would appear that these seven young men were deliberately, perhaps in a voluntary fashion, ritually killed and then dedicated to the Pleiades, the seven sisters. So this would create the Hieros Gamos, or the sacred marriage between us below and those above. This would have been in other words, that tribe, the Hopewell tribe that created the seven mounds, would be related through marriage to the seven sisters. It's difficult for us to understand such a thing, such a blood sacrifice, but nonetheless, there it is. Now, it's an interesting place to go to. It's difficult for us to perhaps sympathize or come into a common regard with people that sacrificed. But nonetheless, it's an interesting place to see if you're interested in seeing how high a former society could go. Now, that doesn't relate to the flood story, but it does relate to the astronomy. And it is a place I think that's worth seeing. The other place that I mentioned is Pipestone. You have to watch my time with this. I don't want to go.
Yeah, use the timer at 8 o'clock.
Okay, should we quit now or?
For a break, you mean?
Do we need a break?
O'clock?
We take a 5-minute break now, or?
Well, I'll tell you what, let me finish Pipestone. and
Yeah,
then we'll take-
yeah, plenty of break.
All right.
All right.
I'm ready.
Okay. Now, I'm talking about the three prominent sacred sites in Minnesota. The Grand Mound, which unfortunately is off limits, but it's worth at least studying until they reopen it. I feel it will be reopened, hopefully next summer. But it's important for us to know about that. The other are the St. Paul Mounds, which are kind of frightening, but still on a level of greatness that's not really appreciated until you know something about them. The third is the most accessible of them all. Actually, it's two in one. One place is known as the Jeffers Petroglyphs. They're in the southeast, towards the southeast corner of the state. And the Jeffers Petroglyph site is the largest petroglyph site in all of North America, one of the largest in the world, and also one of the oldest and continuous petroglyph sites. So it's an outstanding petroglyph. Petroglyph meaning, of course, is stone writing or stone letters. And the reason why it's there is because the natural topography lends itself well to that sort of thing. There are great slabs of stone that are pretty soft stone, and you can engrave whatever you want in it pretty easily. And so many tribes over the course of centuries or millennia, actually millennia, I think the oldest stone petroglyph there goes to back about 3,700 BC, which is, in other words, 7 centuries before Egypt got started with its first dynasty. Amazing. Something like that is here in our own state. Most of the petroglyphs are beautiful, but inscrutable. We don't know what they mean. And we're not supposed to really understand them in a literal sense for the most part anyway. They're supposed to evoke an aesthetic response. Native Americans and shamans all over the world always used and still continue to use art, all forms of art, performance art, to help achieve an altered state of consciousness. And that's the only way that you access the spiritual verities, the spiritual energies. It'd be the same thing as if someone had never heard Beethoven's symphony, and you hand them, but they can read music, and you hand them the score for Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and they read through it and says, oh, well, whoever wrote this, wonderful orchestration, that's really marvelous achievement. Now I'm going to put it aside, and what else? They wouldn't experience it, they wouldn't know. But to hear Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, that's a different thing. To read the notes as a technical musician give you an intellectual appreciation of it. But to hear Benjamin, that is, you don't need to know the score. You don't need to know anything about music technique. It changes your life. It can and has changed the lives of people for well over going on 200 years now. And that's the same thing with spirituality and religion. All the indoctrination and the dogma in the world might be interesting and helpful and certain valuable. Don't mean to say it isn't, but it's not the experience. And that goes back to the aesthetic experience that you encounter at Jeffers Petroglyphs. And it's wonderful to see that place. And it's all there. You can wander there and see it. And you can recognize, however, some things that I've already discussed. There is a wonderful petroglyph that shows, in fact, it's reproduced a couple of times, that shows Wessa-Hisa, shows the horned giant next to the turtle, and behind him is a circle. That circle, so I'm told, represents the hole in the ocean that was left when this great land sank. And so what we're seeing in this petroglyph is Wessa-Hisa following the turtle to Turtle Island. That's the real story there. No one knows how old that petroglyph is. It's very worn. You can still see it quite well. So when you go first to Jeffers Petroglyphs, about 40 minutes further east, you come to a place called Pipestone, Minnesota. I'll wrap this up as quickly as I can. And Pipestone. And there, they call it Pipestone because it is surrounded by cliffs of Catlinite. Catlinite was named after George Catlin. And George Catlin was this really amazing early American. He was a wonderful artist. America in those days, the early part of the 19th century, we're talking about the early 1800s, America was really the eastern seaboard, and the West was considered Ohio. That was considered the far West in the early 1800s. And what George Catlin did is he literally walked alone. It's amazing to think about this. He walked alone from his home, I forgot where it was, maybe it was upstate New York, all the way out to Wyoming and the Rocky Mountains, completely alone. And he carried with him on his back his art supplies. He was a wonderful portrait artist. And his goal was to document as many Native Americans as possible, make their portrait. And he did the same thing each time. He would go to a village. This took terrific guts. He would go to a village where no white man had ever been seen before or heard about, or the encounters were not always happy. He would go to a village, outside the village, and he'd set up his easel. And people would run out to see him, and he would take just one person. There's no language communication whatsoever, of course. He takes one person, usually a child, to start, and he would paint beautifully. So then, it's incredible magic, of course, to Native people, and they would run back to the village and tell the chief about it. The same thing happened over and over again. And then the chief would come out and see this, and of course, the chief then demanded to have his portrait done. And Catlin would do a very good job. He was a very good quick sketch artist also, so it didn't take long. Sometimes the chief would stop and run back to the village and send him back for his biggest headdress, things like that. So it's very human. And he would do the chief's portrait and then, of course, give it to the chief. Well, that opened the door. And he was considered, honored guest. And he would paint more and more of these natives. And in that particular tribe, he'd be a guest of that tribe. And then the word would spread to other tribes that there's this crazy white man here who has all this magic, and leave him alone. And they would hang on Catlin these badges. He didn't know what they were, but if any other tribesman came over and they saw that badge, boy, it was hands off, because it was kind of a passport. And he collected eventually hundreds of these things. He was out there for, I think, close to 20 years. Unbelievable. He stayed with the Mandan, I think, for going on well over a year, where he was fated, actually. And it was in Pipestone that he saw Catlin. Well, it wasn't called Catlin then, it was just the flesh of our ancestors. And no one knew what that was, and they gave him pieces of it. And he brought it back to the east when he was finished, and no scientist had ever seen this before, no geologist had ever seen it. Pipestone is kind of rare. It's mostly confined to the southeastern Minnesota, southwestern Minnesota. There are other pipestone deposits in Wisconsin, but not on that scale. And so it was called Catlinite, it's named after George Catlin. And they shared that story with him. And that he said that is why most of the
Oh, I
Do
think,
you have more?
yes, we have lots of
Yeah, because of that.
just wondering if I should be advancing on this?
Yeah, more slides. You have more pictures of that?
yes, quite a bit.
Yeah.
Okay, let's, yeah.
Well, there is Grand Mound. We finally got to Grand
Okay.
Mound. And the tail of it is on the other side of this photograph. But this to Native Americans, when they go there, they do it in memory of their ancestors, that's to be sure. But they also know that this was a cautionary tale, a cautionary myth, that their ancestors had a great society, flourished a long while, and they lost it. How did they lose it? As other societies, and as perhaps our societies, how did they lose it? So they're very conscious of that. And the other thing is, not just as how you lose your society and you can't lose it, but also as individuals, we experience loss. We experience our own great floods, our own great cataclysms, but we revive. How did they do this in the ancient time? How do we survive? So it's always a dichotomy. It's always on two levels. You find that everywhere. You can go to the next slide. I won't go on too much.
Okay, this is this one?
Yeah, this apparently, actually, this particular shot of a comet, I don't know which one it is, but I chose it. I grabbed it off the internet because it most resembles the Grand Mound. Its tail, of course, a lot of it is overgrown. It needs to be restored, but the archaeologists know it really resembles this pretty closely. So it's obviously the Grand Mound is not dedicated to the great muskrat, which is preposterous, or a serpent, but most likely it is the hairy star that was tossed to earth by the gods. Next. And there, that square you see at the far bottom left, that is where both the Jeffers petroglyph site and Pipestone may be found. It's located. Okay. This is Catlinite. I don't know how well this turned out on here. This is this. You can see it now, and there's quite a bit of it. And the only people in this area, in the state of Minnesota anyway, only persons allowed to work it are Native Americans. What's interesting about Pipestone too, it just occurred to me, all Native American tribes have their own sacred places, as I said, but Pipestone is not indicative of one particular tribe. The tribes from all over North America come to celebrate their ancestral origins after this great flood in Pipestone, and then they smoke the peace pipe. The peace pipe, and that's what it is, the calumet made out of this marvelous catlinite, the flesh of the ancestors of the Native Americans. The peace pipe, sure, it can be made as a covenant between people politically and so forth. There is an example of one of George Catlin's early paintings, and this is what he did. And this is a matter of fact, a Native American who's not too far from Pipestone, and that is his pipe. That's his calumet. The idea of smoking the pipe is not so much amongst men. The smoke goes to heaven. This is a covenant between human beings and the gods and the spiritual verities, the spiritual energies. That's what it's supposed to be. You can go to the next. And there is George Catlin. You see his own clothes completely wore out after a while, and so he was decked out. These clothes were all given to him. He was terrifically loved by all the tribes. He was never maltreated. He was never threatened. The only bad thing that almost happened wasn't too terrible, is that he almost ignited a tribal war. No, I would say a war, but a tribal skirmish, because one tribe wanted to keep him as a guest, and the other tribe wanted to keep him as a guest, and so they got in an argument about that, and so he settled it in a very amicable way. I won't go on to that. His diaries are wonderful to read, but there is the man. And when he got back to the East, he displayed many of his paintings, and he made copies of some of them. It's a huge hit, an international hit. People came from actually all over Europe to see these galleries that he had. And it's a shame that he's not better remembered. But okay, we can go on. And this is the large falls, and this is one of the reasons why the early shamans chose pipestone, not just for the Catlinite, but because this is another reminder or visualization of the flood that dispersed their people. This is what is most commonly carved by Native Americans. Fish, marine imagery. This is a pipe, and it's all supposed to be mnemonic devices to make you think, oh, well, this was our ancestors made terrible mistakes. They were punished. We cannot do that. And next, this is, I don't have time to talk about this one particularly, but it's very interesting. This one represents a wolf. Now, why a wolf? What does that have to do with the Great Flood? The wolf clan is the clan that most preserves the story of the deluge. And they are the keepers of the deluge. And they share this with other tribes. And that's why it's a wolf. Next one. And there's the turtle again. This is by far the most common image found on the pipestone. You know, people would wonder, like, why are they always carving these pipestones, like in the turtles and fish and occasionally wolves and so on? Again, it's to just reaffirm this great catastrophe. This one you can't make out too well. It's I think this is also a turtle at the top. Yeah. Next one. Yeah, turtles. Yeah, they're just all over the place. Okay. I'll stop here for a break. Well, you can go back. We'll just finish this one, then I'll stop for a break. This is the Jeffers petroglyph site. To give you an idea, you can multiply this by 100-fold, and that's what you see when you go out there. Some of them are more modern. There's one that represents a man on a horse. Others are a little less sure. Most of them. But it's a tremendous visual experience, and you're looking at work that has been done over the course of thousands of years. So I think that's it. We'll break for a few minutes, and then I'll finish this. This is a representation at the Jeffers petroglyph. Is it right? Okay, all right. Well, the figure on the left, that's the turtle. And you see on his back that there is a cross. That means that this turtle represents the center of the world. And that's one of the references to the great land that was lost to the sea. It was the center of the world. And so that's a turtle. And behind him is Wessahisa in the guise of this giant. When he became the giant, he changed his name to Waxexi. I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly. In some traditions, Waxexi. Actually, this is the Jeffers place. There's another representative of Waxexi, or Wessahisa, with his horned helmet. This is again another one of Jeffers petroglyphs. Okay. Now this one is also a representative of Waxexi. This is an aerial photograph. This is in Wisconsin. This is near Devil's Lake in Baraboo, Wisconsin. It's referred to as the Man Mound. It is about 180 feet long. When the road was built at the bottom there, they cut off his legs, unfortunately. And so they've had some restoration at the bottom. Okay, next. This is an upside down photograph of Waxexi in Wisconsin, Baraboo, and that's representation of his horned helmet again. This you can't see from the ground. those white outlines are chalk outlines that are put there by the archaeologists so you can see it more clearly. Okay, next. And this is in Wisconsin. I hope it's clear to you. It's not very clear to us here.
Oh, it's very clear.
Oh, it's good? Okay, that's
Looking
good.
on our Zoom,
Okay.
it's super clear.
So, this would be in south central Wisconsin. I'm gonna- This is a better aerial view of the man mound. And it's very well preserved. There's no specific date on it. No one knows how old it is. They don't know the tribal affiliation with it either, but it's very recognizable. Okay, not very nice. We'll skip that next one. Yeah, the next one. And it is close to this place called Devil's Lake. Now, its original name was Spirit Lake. That's what the Native Americans referred to as Spirit Lake. And when the missionaries came through here, they said, well, the spirits you're worshiping are all demonic, so we will rename the lake for you. We'll call it Devil's Lake from now on. Next one. And Devil's Lake is surrounded by really strange formations, some of them natural, some of them modified. This one, we're not sure exactly what it is, but it's very strange. It's one of many peculiar monoliths surrounding the lake. Next one. This one, though, is more understandable. This has been terraformed. It's been modified by someone in the deep past. So that slot makes it referred to by local Native Americans as the doorway to the sun. It's called the doorway to the sun. And you can see in the next slide why it is called that, because of this. The modifications are so subtle and so beautifully done that you have the winter solstice available, and then we'll go back, and then the summer solstice available. And it is in effect an instrument or a machine that is still working after thousands of years period of time. The idea of, we'll go back just a little bit.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I should have told you. The concept of this, archaeologists will say, well, the ancient people needed to know when to plant things. It was just an agricultural thing. No, it isn't. Because even those primitive Neolithic farmers didn't need help from any astrological orientations to find out when is the best planting times. That's the obvious one. Or harvesting time, especially harvesting. No, this was a purely spiritual concept at work here, which is honoring the longest and the shortest days of the year, the longest and the shortest nights of the year. The long nights at the winter solstice are representative of death and loss and darkness and ignorance and terror. But when the sun comes back, then the days begin to lengthen again. So there's that eternal hope and the revival, the sense of resurrection that is implicit in these nature or mystery religions. Okay, next. At the base of Devil's Lake is this effigy. This is a plaque, a bronze plaque that you can find there. And this is the outline of a bird or a bird man. It is kind of a bird man. Now, it is not visible. This is the interesting thing. It is not visible from the ground. If you walk up to this thing, you cannot see it at all. It doesn't make any sense. But if you go to that cliff that we saw earlier, you can go back just a little bit if you can. If you go to this, you can look down and you can barely make out the bird mound. It's barely there. However, on the same day, when we're getting these solar orientations, when the sun goes down in the west, as it's doing here, go back to that bird mound, a shadow will appear off of the wings and the head of this figure and will elongate until almost all of the figure is clearly seen. And it's only clearly seen on 2 days of the year. of the winter solstice and the summer solstice.
Mhm.
So and the bird is a universal human archetype, something that always comes back. It leaves in the wintertime and it returns in the spring. It's associated with human rebirth and revival. So this is the key metaphysics at work in this story of the Great Flood. Terror, destruction, loss, but regeneration, rebirth, experienced on the level of a society and also on an individual level. Okay, next. Well, I can hardly make out this map, but this is now in South Dakota. And this is in the place, I can go to the next one. This is in another extremely important sacred site that doesn't belong to any particular tribe. It's a place that is celebrated by tribes from all over North America, and it's called Bear Butte. It doesn't resemble a bear at all. It's not meant to. But the bear symbolism involved in this is, again, the nature of death or the sleep of death and revival. In the same way that the bear goes into hibernation, he looks like he's dead for months at a time, and then the spring comes and he's revived. And it is here that the Great Flood is celebrated. Okay, go to the next one. The reason why this particular site, it's not even a butte, by the way, in the sense that we understand a butte. It is actually a laccolith. A laccolith is a kind of rare phenomena that happens, especially in North America. There are not many examples of this. A laccolith is where magma forces, volcanic forces, deep in the earth, break through the surface of the earth. They crack open the surface and create a kind of a dome, a volcanic dome. Sometimes those domes collapse back into the earth, and it is relatively rare when this dome rises and cools and hardens enough so that it turns into this kind of a butte or mountain. And that's what this is. It's not a natural mountain. It's certainly not a butte. It's this laccolith. It is all volcanic. And the reason why this was chosen by the Native Americans is because it most resembles the land from which their ancestors came. That's why we have this lake there. It was a mountainous place, as is described in their myths and in their legends. And that is why they celebrate that. Next one. It's another example. This is not an unusual meteorological phenomena taking place there. Events like this helped to convince the early shamans that this was the sacred place to experience this birth, death, and rebirth symbolism. The next one. And this highlights Bear Butte and the way it's conceived as the lost homeland, as it were. Next. Yeah. This is now a place in Iowa. I'm getting confused by this. I have to refer to this. Yeah. This place is called the Marching Bears. The next photograph. This is the Marching Bears seen from the air, of course, and they're outlined in chalk. The next one. And this is a LiDAR photograph, which is a special archaeological technique that's just come into play in the last, say, 5 years or so, that outlines the marching bears better. Next one. And this shows the bears are led by two birds that are outlined here in chalk. Well, what does all this mean? Again, the bear is the symbol of birth and death and rebirth, just as the birds are. Okay, you can go back. I go back a little bit to the first one again, to the map. And the marching bears are located at the extreme eastern end of the state of Iowa, just across the Mississippi River. It's a marvelous place to go. Now, again, these mounds are completely invisible at ground level. They're very large. You can't make them out at all. And that's not because they were eroded. It's because they're in very excellent shape, very excellent condition, but because they're meant to be that way. I was told by an Oneida shaman a long time ago, or long to me, 28 years ago, when I visited there and other places in this area, that this was used as a, you can go back to the marching bears, that the marching bears were used as a school for shamans. He said that what would happen was that a candidate for being a shaman, a student, was taken to this line of marching bears. And he could not distinguish it on the ground where it was. No one could. And as part of his matriculation, as it were, he had to project his consciousness at height. He had to be able to bring his conscious mind out of his body and then look down from where he was. In other words, astral project. He had to astral project himself out of his body and look down. And then the shaman would ask him the question, what did you see? And he said, I saw a line of marching bears led by two birds. Well, then you pass. But if you said, I didn't see anything, or it was all hazy, well, start over again. You have to try again. But it's interesting that they were actively trying to strengthen and activate, energize the human capacity for what's known as the flight of the shaman. That's known all over the world, whether it's in Siberia or in Iowa here, or in ancient Greece or ancient Egypt. It's always referred to as the flight of the shaman. The flight of the shaman meant to extend one's consciousness far beyond the material world. Or the next one. That's a really excellent sight. You can see here that on the far right end, you see the birds. And that's implicit in this whole thing because the bird flies. The bird can see this. So that's all part of the matriculation process for shamans. And apparently it still is used that way. Although this is a national park now, and people can go there certain times, the shamans and their students still go there. Next. And we'll do one more. Well, and there's my book. I'm getting close to the end of my time. They're going to throw us out of here, I guess, eventually. So I wanted to leave the last 15 minutes or so before 9 o'clock. If anyone has any questions on any of this or any comments, I'd be glad to share whatever we can together. It'll be fine.
I'll stop the slideshow.
Yes, and don't be shy. And I've also put a link to Amazon that shows his many books.
Weird. It's locking on Susan for some reason. I will spotlight this one. Is that? All right.
So any questions, unmute yourself. And jump in, please. There's so much. That was excellent. Thank you. Awesome.
Thank you.
I just want to mention I saw Jennifer's comment to us in the chat about Devil's Lake. Jennifer, you saw everything in person.
Well, I didn't see the mounds. I didn't know they were there, but it's a place that my family loves to camp, and the bluffs are incredible because the stone. I can't remember what the bluffs are made out of, which stone, but they're shiny red with smooth, shiny red with black flecks in them, and they heat up a lot from the sun, and they create big thermals so that there's lots of hawks and eagles that circle. They're like an amazing amount of raptors that just kind of circle in the thermals. And so you'd be hiking on the bluffs, and the hawks and the eagles are right there, like right next to you, like circling around. And those stone formations are absolutely amazing. it's one of the a favorite place for climbers. People are always climbing those rocks, and that's the sun window thing. That's a particular favorite for climbers. They climb up to the top of that thing. My son climbs there. He used to climb there, and so now it's very cool to hear you know, a whole nother dimension of richness there that I wasn't aware of. I'm going to go and try to find, can we if we go to the mound, would we be able to tell from the ground, or would you absolutely have to be above the ground to?
You can go directly to the mound and you will not see it. You just see at most a couple of bumps. It's impossible to find from the ground. However, they have that plaque there. I showed that earlier. There's an old bronze plaque. And when you go there, you can see the plaque and you know exactly where the mound is there. And then if you climb, and it isn't a hard climb at all, you just follow the trail up there and you're going to be about, maybe 150, at most 200 feet above the mound. Then you can kind of make it out a little. But the best time, really the only time to be there, is on the solstices. That's why they made that bird mound there. Then when the sun sets, then you see, and it's terrific. First you see the head, and you can't even make out what it is, but you see a little dark area, and then it gets more roundish, and it kind of looks like, I thought it looked like a man's or a human head, and it might be like the bird man.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting if it is a man's head. And then later on, as the sun continues to set, the shadows lengthen along the wings. You can see the wings really well and a little bit of the body. What's interesting, if it is a human head, and I kind of think it is, that's terrific, because the ancient Egyptians had a name for the soul. It was called the Ba. And the Ba was had a bird's body with a human head on it. And there's there are a lot of hieroglyphic inscriptions that show the Ba, like you can read the Book of the Dead, for example. You can buy that, and sure enough, they'll show this human-headed bird, and that is how the Egyptians conceived of the human soul. It's amazing whether there was any connection between ancient Egypt or the Indians. It doesn't even make much difference. It's as though the same metaphysical conclusions are being made on both sides of the world, and that helps to verify something about them. But it was really great to hear your experiences there. It obviously meant a lot to you on the heart level, and that's the most important. It's great to know all these things. It enhances it, but the main thing again is the experience that you. That's wonderful.
Yeah,
Thanks.
well, it's just a beautiful place. The deep, cool lake is beautiful, and the bluffs are beautiful, and it's a great place to camp and hike. But I wanted to ask another question. Are these sites protected in any way? I mean, I noticed that his feet were cut off by a road. I mean,
Yes.
are the local whoever owns the land, are they aware of these things? Do they protect them?
Yes, the Man Mound is owned by the state of Wisconsin. It is protected. When you go there, you can climb up to a little tower about 40 feet high, and you can kind of make it out a little bit. That's another mound that you cannot tell from the ground hardly at all. You have to know what you're looking for. If you climb the tower, you can kind of make it out. You've really got to be at altitude, several hundred feet. I'd say a good 200 feet, 300 feet to see this thing in all its glory. The legs were cut off a long time ago, I think about 1925 or something like that. And the local people were so upset about that they got the state of Wisconsin to own it, to buy it, and then to restore it as best they could. The road, unfortunately, is still there, but there was another man mound not far away, the same figure, only that one is completely gone. One more parenthetical thing about the man mound, there is a figure very similar to that man mound, and it is not in Wisconsin. It's on the side of a hill, just the same as that one is. It's bigger and older, and it's outside of Bristol in England. It's known as the Long Man of Wilmington. And the resemblance between the two is remarkable. Archaeologists doing work on the Long Man of the long man of Wilmington, that's what they call it, found out that he too originally had a horned helmet. So here we have, and he's on a hill with the same astronomical orientations as the one in Wisconsin outside of Baraboo. Isn't that remarkable?
Mhm.
Here you have a flood hero in Wisconsin portrayed identically to a flood hero in England outside of Bristol. They're both on the slope of a hill with the exact same angle towards the sun. So it is beyond coincidence. There's no doubt that Columbus, whether he made it here before anybody else or not, that's a whole other thing. There's no doubt that there was an ancient connection between, hard as it is to imagine, between the upper Midwest and England. It's also outlined in chalk, same as here,
Oh, wow.
same thing.
I want to jump in. Jerry has a question. Jerry has his hand up. Go ahead, Jerry. Unmute yourself. Thank you.
All right. So my question is, have you talked to Native Americans to know that these things are continuing part of their spiritual experience? Do modern people still use these things for spiritual experience?
Yes, they do. Thank God they do. The tragedy about it is that most of modern tribal Indians, the younger generation, has no interest in any of this whatsoever and is embarrassed many times about it and want to be good Americans. And their idea of a good American is to just leave all this Indian stuff behind. And so in a way, it's good, because before, all this information that I shared with you was considered privileged information amongst what they called the medicine lodges. What that meant by medicine is not what we meant by medicine. Medicine means to them something powerful and healing, not necessarily an aspirin tablet. And the Native Americans shared these traditions of theirs with nobody except their fellow tribal members. And they were locked up in these, especially the Medawin Society, still exists today. These are all oral traditions. But now, because of their sons and daughters straying away from all this, not taking interest in, and these old people, the elders, are dying off. And when they go, their stories will go with them, because they're just not enough young. That's why they have like powwows and things like that. They're beginning to open up and share this. The powwows are dramatizations of a lot of these things. And they're hoping to get their own young people involved. They are getting some involved, but it's a serious problem. All this culture is in danger of being lost. And so they're finally thinking, well, we have to find white people of goodwill who will not abuse this information. It's so precious to us. And so I felt very grateful and privileged that they do share these things. I just came back from a conference in Upper Michigan, where there were a number of Native Americans who were really open with us and shared these things, and thought that the conference was wonderful because they saw that we were open-spirited in this. We're not exploiters. We want to learn their past, which is, and they have always said it really is everybody's past. But of course, the bad experiences between Native Americans and modern Europeans that came here was so bad. The worst thing, as they said, even worse than the wars with the Indians, far worse than that, was the cultural genocide that was practiced against them. When there was a period, especially in the mid-19th century, and it persisted really into the 20th century, in which there was an effort on the part of even presidents to completely Christianize and at the same time demonize all of Native American traditions. Turn them into good Christians, and they'll be good Americans then. Well, that didn't work out. And that they considered that really worse than the worst thing that ever happened, to try to stop them from talking their own language and from sharing these precious oral traditions, and demonizing them and replacing everything with a totally foreign concept. So that's, yes, to answer your question, yes, I try to learn as much as I can from them. And they have a lot to share.
Berta, I think you have your hand up.
Yeah, and Frank, I just wanted to let you know also some of the tribes, and I have a feeling more of the tribes now are making a real effort to teach young people language, and the native languages. Certainly in the Ojibwe tribe, which I'm a member of, there's lots of language education, but they're also doing like where you like my niece. You can build crafts. You can build your regalia, and the Fond du Lac has programs where in places with elders where I could go if I was in Duluth all the time, but my niece is doing it, and my uncle works there. But where they can go and start learning some of these native crafts and language, and yeah, it is really lovely, and it's kind of fun. Just kind of fun the things they're teaching.
It's meant to be fun, of course. I'm glad that that's happening, and we can only hope that it will continue to be that way. And that's why they're so interested in this flood story, and that's why I talk about it, because they feel endangered by another catastrophe. Their final bowing out, being lost completely. But then they look back to their past and they see that, well, they had already gone through this and it was really bad, but somehow they survived and came through it. And that's what they want to learn, is how did they survive that? What things did they emphasize? And I think what they learned from that is that they learned about their identity, their cultural identity. And that's why they're bringing that out. So thank you for sharing that. I think that's very heartening to hear that. And as they bring this out now, they're not as inward as they used to be. There's this now, they're making a contribution to world culture. That's what they're doing.
But isn't that also because we're appreciating
Yes.
the world? We are saying back to you, thank you so much. We appreciate this so much. This is so valuable, and we need this. Thank you.
We all need it, yes, as well. Yeah, it's really tragic, because in the beginning, the Native Americans opened up completely when the first white men came here, shared everything, and the whites took no interest in it whatsoever, and helped to demonize it. I mean, it's tragic. It's a real tragedy. But now, hopefully, we can make up for that, because our society is shaking to bits now. Now, our society is threatened. We have lunatics on both sides of the world with itchy trigger fingers on nuclear weapons. How insane is that? So we need some kind of comfort. We need to look back on things too. Like I said at the beginning, there are more dead civilizations than there are living ones. Quite a bit more. Why should we be any exception? Especially these days. So I think that there is a lot of commonality. This conference that I came from emphasizes contacts between the ancient old world and America long before Columbus. Well, that's heretical. The archaeologists talk about demonizing. We know what it's like to be demonized, because that's totally heretical. But not to the Native Americans. They know about all those contacts, and they love us. Well, and I'm sorry, go on, I get carried away. Yep. Anyone else? I'd love to hear what I have to say.
Well, I don't know. We're probably running out of time, but I'm totally interested to see if there are any shaman being trained at seeing the bears lined up, and
Yeah.
to go out of body and train to talk to their ancestors.
Yes, that is going on today. A lot of that is pretty precious stuff. And because you have to be initiated, those things are not as openly shared, because it's a step process. It's not just like a myth. It's a practice. And so I don't know how, I get the impression that the native elders, the shamans, are not always open on that. And that's their privilege. That's their fun. But to answer your question, yes, they are still using sacred sites, native sites, to educate their people to become shamans and to be active spiritual leaders. It is happening.
I have a quick question. I don't know if it's, there's a theory, I don't know if it's a accepted norm now, that that the Great Flood was a comet or some such thing hitting the ice age ice sheet and immediately melting it, and also causing a carbonization, like nano diamond layer or something
Miracles.
across the planet, and then unleashing a great immediate flood through all that water melting. Is that fringy? Is that accepted now as a standard explanation, or do you know?
Well, it's very interesting. The scientists who came out with that, one was a PhD by the name of Firestone, and it was in the early part of this century. He came out with a book in which he postulated that, and it was pretty vigorously attacked by mainstream science. And then he has a rebuttal. I forgot the name of it. I think it was called Resurrection. I remember. But Firestone's book was a rebuttal that took him 3 or 4 years to write, and has been so well received now by mainstream geophysicists and astronomers that there is a general consensus building that it is inescapable that this actually did happen. The physical evidence for a comet striking Lake Michigan, that's where it struck. It struck Lake Michigan. The physical evidence is at the point where it's overwhelming, and there's a general consensus. Now, if this is the event that triggered this great flood, the loss of some other place, it could have been. But we're also learning that the Earth is a far more geologically active place than we ever imagined before, that there have been several major, almost global floods and global incidents. Well, just keep in mind, now it's thoroughly accepted that it was Chicxulub, the great asteroid that collided with the Earth that caused the extinction of almost 70% of all living things on Earth. If you had suggested such a thing 50 years ago, people would have thought that's a science fiction. Now it is totally accepted because of the overwhelming evidence, mostly the iridium. And now it's with this comet. So now that comet took place about 10,000 years ago. It caused the revival of ice age conditions. That might have been it, or it might have been another. We do know that there was a major comet much more recently than that that struck the Earth in 1200 BC. That was Comet Encke. There's no doubt about that. So it's hard to tell. See, the Indians have ideas of time which are completely different, conceptions differently than us. Their myths and their stories are very vivid from a very human point of view, but they don't chronicle things historically like our historians. There's quite a big cultural gap there. So if you ask the Native Americans, well, when did this flood happen? Oh, a long time ago. They're not going to say, well, it happened on the 12th of August and 10,000 BC. They don't have references like that. Well, it was a long time ago. But that doesn't mean that they haven't anything to contribute, because the story is at least valuable in that it talks about a previous civilization. They refer to a previous civilization and a migration and how they got here. And that story is enshrined, believe me, in every Native American tribe. I don't know of a single Native American tribe that doesn't have its own story of the Great Flood and how their ancestors came. They're all variations on it. Some of the variations are significant, but nonetheless, there is that story. And that's amazing, because when you think about it, and if you're aware of this, the racial and linguistic differences amongst Native American tribes in North America is greater than the racial and linguistic differences amongst peoples in Europe. You have a huge, vast, you have the short, stocky Pimas in the American Southwest. Then you have the tall, robust Mohawk in the Northeast. You have the beardless Indians in Florida, the Seminole, and then you have the Indians, the Tlingit and the Haida in British Columbia. They're full bearded. The differences are phenomenal, and yet they all have that story. And we're lucky to be in Minnesota because this part of the world, because it's at the Pipestone National Monument that it is really enshrined. And it is also in Iowa, not that far from us, at the Lacolith, at the Bear Butte. And it's in our own state, the far north, at Grand Mound, where the comet is. A fire that was thrown into the water is enshrined. So these are places I think we need to seek out, especially as our own civilization begins to shatter itself and have its own tremors. Our destruction will appear to be more man-made. So, well, I don't want to talk politically about these things, but it's great to be able to share it with you all. And I really enjoy these talks with us. You know, I think we all have pieces of the puzzle.
You know, I always go back to your book, which is The Connection with Atlantis. And so it also seems like the planting of these peoples had something to do with the ability to move across the planet with flying ships. I mean, the turtle sounds like a flying ship to me.
Well, it's
And
interesting.
they talk about flying ships. I mean, a lot of the traditions do talk about flying ships.
Well, just parenthetically about that, in tradition of India, they talk about the Vimanas,
Yeah.
which are supposedly, they sound like almost like UFOs. I mean, this has been in their vernacular for thousands of years. I mean, it's been in their, it goes, the mention of the Vimanas appears in the Rig Veda, I mean, which is like at least 3,200 years old. And on the other side of the world, here in North America, among the Hopi Indians, they talk about, and I don't know that I pronounced this correctly, Pabuwatuma. I think it's close to Pabumatuma. And the Hopi Indians will, and this is in Frank Waters' book, and Frank Waters was a great researcher who lived amongst the Hopi, spoke the Hopi dialects, and got their myths down. And the Pabuwatuma, if I know I don't pronounce it correctly, are described as the same thing as Vimanas. And the Hopi say that when they came here, with their flood story, some of their chiefs chose to come on these flying discs. That's the way they appear, and they're like flying discs. Pabumatwas, and they resemble the Vimanas that are spoken about in India on the other side of the world. It's remarkable. How do we explain? How do we honestly explain this commonality? It can't be dismissed. Oh, it's just coincidence. What was going on?
Yeah, it's fascinating. And guys, I'm sorry, but my owl will only show me.
Yeah,
From
it's
over there. It's
also
not-
crashed.
And neither
I'm
of us.
looking for Frank.
Yeah, I can't,
We can't, I can't, and we can't, we keep going. click, click,
there's a
click,
phone
click.
app, but it's not connected.
Yeah, none of us, yeah,
Yeah.
neither of us can get it over there.
So I think it's,
why
well,
I'm
it's a sign that we're supposed to get out
I
of here.
think we
Oh.
have to,
Yeah.
close up because we have to leave by 9:30. So
Yeah.
thank you so much all.
Thank
for
you very
being here.
much.
Thank you.
And thank you so much, Frank.
Great
for
seeing.
Awesome talk again. This is all recorded. I'll get it edited. I'll have it up on YouTube, and thank you all for being here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hope. Great job setting this up.
Thank you.
Yes.
Paul, it would not have happened.
And Paul, whoever's involved, thank you for making this.
All the tech. All right, we'll go now. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Ready?
Bye.
Bye.
Good
See you
night.
again. See you again.
And we-